Welcome to Conversations with the Authors.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Conversations with the Authors. I'm your host, Daniel.
I'm Daryl.
I'm Sandra.
And thank you for pressing the play button. And as always, thank you, Alexander Nakarada, for the intro music. It's always appreciated and always enjoyed. Just like music, diversity is important. Different instruments and things, different musicians, they have their own personality and style to music. Just like a recipe, diversity is important because the style of the chefs, the ingredients you use, the seasonings you use can make a dish or break a dish. And in writing, particularly in sci-fi fantasy, as you did with How Nicholas Became Santa Claus, your highly rated, Eric Hoffer nominated sci-fi fantasy novel, diversity is also important. Particularly, you use them in your Oddling characters, which are the fanciful characters which live in the Orphic Forest. We've talked about diversity before in our podcast, but I think I want to go a little more in depth into how you sort of tackled this in writing sci-fi fantasy. So my first, I suppose, important question would be why do you feel that it was important to actively incorporate diversity and inclusion in your fantasy world, and how does it contribute?
Well, diversity is a fact of real life. And one of the things we want to do is we want to make the reader feel as if he's in a real world. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so diversity means different things to different people. In this case, it's not just, not a racial diversity or something like that you might come to mind, but a diversity of characters, of different species of characters, and because our characters are different from humans. Some are human and some aren't, but all I think the principal characters are sentient. Mm-hmm. So we want to show different types for interest.
And it's interesting because we talked in our last podcast about the movie Avatar. And I mentioned that because, like you said, we're not talking about necessarily race or religion. But in order to make the world feel real, as we talk about in our previous podcasts, to make this fantasy novel world resonate with our readers, we do have to pull from our own reality, because that's what helps to make it believable. So we have to borrow from things in our real lives. So while we're not using cultures or religions per se, that we do take samples, for lack of a better term, to create these characters.
A sample is an excellent term, because what I did was I took photographs. And a photograph is a sampling of time and location. For that one split second, everything is identical. But if you look at it like a jigsaw puzzle, or you take that photograph and you break it into a jigsaw puzzle that you have to match the pieces and put them together, everything has to be balanced and integrated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When dealing with other cultures and religions, how do you sample from them to make it authentic and not...
Well, our characters are a lot of them are non-human. Mm-hmm. And yet to have our audience relate to them, we have to give them certain human qualities and emotions. Mm-hmm. And we give them struggles that readers can empathize with. Mm-hmm. And we need this connection, and it helps ground the story in reality. Right. It makes it easier for readers to suspend their belief. The story is non-political, really,
right?
And I think within the story itself, there's a similar culture
Right.
of benevolence and greed,
But there's all
and magic.
kinds of cultures.
Right.
A lot of the oddlings are based on the plant world, are based on weather systems. So all of that is essentially each interaction of those animals and those insects and their environment. That's all culture.
Mm-hmm.
So by watching them, by watching us,
And-
I think in crafting a world, we want to pay attention to details. Whether it's the setting, the culture, or history of or the history of the fictional world. We add realistic details, making the fantasy more immersive.
Oh, you mentioned cultures. So I suppose I would then ask, how do you balance cultural accuracy with the creative freedom when building diverse worlds?
Well, I think culture accuracy is a relative term, because especially when you're creating
making up
something,
somebody.
when you're making things up, right.
Right.
But one thing that we want to do is be consistent with it, so that the audience knows the rules.
Right.
It's just like when you think of Dracula, for instance. There are rules. You can't kill him, except with a stake.
Right.
He can't come out during the day ordinarily,
Right.
and he can transform into whatever creature he needs to transform
Right.
into. So those are like basic rules.
Right.
his only true enemy is a werewolf.
And
Yeah.
you mentioned
Who you can kill.
You can kill.
With a silver bullet. So,
Right.
And so with almost any story about those types of characters,
Right.
Those rules are going to be something that they use as a basis.
And my vampires don't glow like rainbows, but that's perhaps another story. We talked about you said, Daryl, that there's no political statement here, but there are, in essence, political parties. Your main part of your trio is part of the monarchy. Right?
Well,
so
monarch, if you want to call that political, I suppose they have their political agendas. They want to collect taxes, and they want to make sure that they maintain law and order.
Right, but so in that regard, in what ways do you address power dynamics and privileges in fantasy fiction?
Well, you don't want bad people on the loose,
Right.
and people have to pay for their crimes.
Right.
And people are rewarded for their benevolence.
Right.
So these things are all consistent with reality.
Right.
So these things we can empathize with, and when we see somebody being bad, we know that crime doesn't pay. So eventually, in the end, ordinarily the good guys win and the bad guys get it. They get what they deserve. Ordinarily in stories, it doesn't always work out that way.
You read a lot of history and you find the commonalities that are present in all different kinds of peoples and situations, wars and not wars, how they address famine and illness, and do they help each other or do they eat each other?
Yeah. And although you're structuring all of these things, and you're making up these things, you also want to allow for the reader's imagination.
Right.
Sometimes we leave details to the reader's imagination, and it kind of enhances their sense of wonder and engagement with the story.
Thinking about diversity, again, like we said, it's not necessarily racial or religious, but in my opinion, as a disabled person, it includes people with disabilities. So my question then becomes, what advice do you have for readers who are aiming to create inclusive worlds that deal with characters who have disabilities and such.
It depends what the type of story that you're writing. Diversity means something different in a fantasy story. Right. So if you wrote a story like Frankenstein,
right,
or
right,
you wrote
right.
a story like Poor Little Things, you've got characters that have other disabilities and are not quite human, they're not quite put together.
Right.
This is escapism, and so, but you're going to have the kind of interesting diversity that might include someone who's a fairy with wings who wants to be a human. You might have a human who wants to acquire the magic of an elf. You may have all kinds of things like that. So diversity means different things in different worlds. It doesn't necessarily mean what you might be inclined for it to mean in your reality.
Right.
I took it in the approach of differences.
Right, but you use those as
but the differences can either be beneficial or not.
Right.
But combined together with other entities who have differences that can either benefit or...
Make no mistake, this story is not my left foot.
Right.
It's not that type of story.
And I'm not talking about necessarily people with disabilities in your story or people with different communities in your story. What I'm talking about at its most basic level, that which makes us different, and how to include everyone in a sense in the story and not.
One of my characters, one of my oddlings, is grass.
Yes.
Well,
it's a grass that it's called spring grass because when you try to step on it, it runs away
or retracts,
or completely retracts, and then when you leave, it comes back, and it becomes incorporated in the story and is used to benefit others.
It gives one assist. A sense of wonderment, and that you're not in Kansas anymore. This is a strange and wonderful environment that has creatures, plant or animal, that are different that you might see in real life.
Mom and Dad, I'm definitely not trying. I'm not trying to be like a Larry King. When it comes to asking these questions, it's sort of more along the idea of trying to understand how is it that you were able to write a story that is for everyone. It's such an immersive story that it lends itself to the reader, and that the reader can be any of these characters regardless of what talents or lack thereof they may or may not have.
Go on. I'm sorry.
When I wrote the story, before I turned it over to your father, I was trying to raise you guys with your different abilities and my different abilities, and trying to combine them all so that I wouldn't offend any of you or be offended myself by things that couldn't be done.
Right.
And I had us all work together to try to help each other as if we were one person. So I tried to take that approach in the story.
I think mine was different because I wanted to not only, if I needed to offend, I would offend, because my bad guy is offensive.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
And I wanted to create a story of wonderment and amazement too. And so...
you guys.
This story is about it's a common trope. It's good versus evil.
Right.
And you get to do things that you normally wouldn't do. I'm generally a follow the rules, don't do anything wrong kind of person, but if the story calls for it, I'll kill you in a second.
Yeah, well, she's
Right,
very
right.
good at that,
Right.
and being able to let herself be uninhibited and write that. I mean, it's like Agatha Christie writing murder novels. This little old woman it writes these things that are intriguing and mysterious, and they set people on edge. So we want to, she sets people's teeth on edge. And if you want to do that, then you got to let yourself go. And we can do that, and it's
Right.
been done.
Right.
You know,
When you write a story, you have to do it from let's pretend.
Well, I think the great thing about how you crafted the story is nothing is left, nothing is beating people over the head in terms of this creature, that has to be this way, and this guy has to think that way, or he's disabled, or this guy's, unless it's prudent to the story. I think you guys do a great job with
Thank you.
that idea of if it's, if there's, going back to the old phrase, if there's a gun on a mantle, then it has to show up later in the story. You don't highlight some particular of a character unless it's prudent to.
I think it goes if in your third act, if there's a gun on a mantle, it better show up in the first act somewhere.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so that you don't say, where did that come from?
Right. Why is it all of a sudden? Right.
Right. Is that a device now? It's convenient. Well, things are not convenient in real life.
And I think when it comes to characters with, oddities about them, particulars, disabilities, things like that, it's kind of like, I think it's like the Book of Eli. Denzel Washington's character, who is wandering through this seemingly post-apocalyptic world with a manuscript of the, Bible. He's a blind character. And it's not necessarily shoved down your throat.
It's not obvious that he's blind either.
It's not obvious.
No, it isn't.
No. That's one of the surprising things you find out.
I think that's the great thing about
no
it.
spoilers here.
I think that a lot of writers, they want to have that sort of shock factor, especially the new ones, and they'll pummel you with this idea of a character who's, unique in some.
Well, I think if you have to pummel somebody, you should probably rewrite your story again.
Yeah.
It's you don't have to do that. Things are subtle.
Right.
Sometimes when you see a story from the beginning, things are happening, and you wonder, why is this happening?
Right.
And you will find out as you go along, as your characters evolve and as the story evolves, why this is happening.
Right.
Some of my oddlings were not intended to be in the story, but the story wrote the oddlings.
I was literally about to ask you that question. I was going to ask you if these characters were something that you fabricated beforehand, or did they, invoke themselves into your story?
Not only the characters, so some situations too, because as one should, and as we did, we wrote from an outline.
Right.
We started the story. First we had a synopsis of the story, then we wrote an outline, so we knew exactly from beginning to end how the story would play through. And it became like a Christmas tree, and sometimes we'd hang ornaments on it. Ornaments would be certain things that we didn't expect to happen, but the story calls for it, and natural progression or evolution would be that would happen. So
it's like
several things like that.
It's like using a GPS. You have a destination planned and set, and you set forth on that destination, and there might be a traffic jam, or there might be a detour somewhere.
Or your GPS decides to send you around in circles and keep saying rerouting.
Well, you have intentions, and your intention is to follow your outline, but you don't need to stick to it obsessively.
Right.
You can be adaptive. And the wonderful thing about human beings is that we're adaptive.
Right.
To be adaptive is to be intelligent, and to be able to come to a conclusion about a situation and be able to survive it.
Right. And there have been times in my own writing as a screenwriter where I've written a story, and you think to yourself, well, the outline says that I need to go this way, but if the story is, sometimes it's worth writing just to see where that goes.
I think I mentioned this earlier in the in a podcast. It's just like the movie Deep Blue with Samuel L. Jackson.
Yes.
And there was a certain scene where he was telling his people that we are not gonna fight anymore. And then the shark comes up inside of the habitat and eats him.
Right.
That wasn't supposed to happen, they said. But it seemed like an appropriate thing, and it seemed like an appropriate place for that to happen.
Right.
But the people who wrote the script said that was kind of improvised.
Right.
So that ended his storyline.
Right. So I think, in the end of the day, inclusivity.
Yes.
Diversity and such are great for stories, but it's best not to force the point. I think, as you wrote with your story, it has to occur naturally, and just like the plot line of your story, if you try to force it into a direction, the audience can tell, and it's not going to work.
And you can't be afraid to stop, look at it, reread it, and then if it doesn't feel comfortable,
just
throw it away.
Right.
Just remember, as in life, as in stories, situations evolve naturally sometimes.
Yes.
And so the circumstances, the right situations, right time is right. Something develops.
You know what?
Let that happen.
And the time is not right. The time is right for our dear listeners and readers to visit our Facebook page at Troop Books, to visit our Instagram, our X, our TikTok, where you can find the link to the author page at the Ewing's Publishing, and you can pick up a hardcover or a soft cover of the book. You can find us at our Facebooks at Troop Books, our Facebook, our Instagram Troop Books, our X at Troop Books, and on our TikTok at Troop Books. And I'll talk to you next time on Conversations with the Authors.